One of the most difficult things about college is figuring out which testing and study strategies work best to get good grades. In this video, I'll try to explain some of the strategies that I used to make sure that I got an A in every class. So I'm going to start with the general mindset with which I approached each class. My overarching theme was that I would spend the most time on classes in which it would be hardest to get an A. I would always try to scope this out before the class even started based on the syllabus and the grading scale. For example, most of my classes required a 95% to get an A instead of an A-. And so in those classes, I knew I would have to work harder and get higher test average than in the classes where it required a 93 or 94%. I would also take into consideration factors like how hard the class was based on what I had heard, and in general how hard the subject was for me personally, so I struggled a lot more with memorization-based classes than concept-based classes, so I knew that I would have to spend more time on a memorization-based class like history or biology than on a concept-based class such as math or chemistry, and I know that for a lot of people it might be the opposite. For example, my cell biology class required a ton of memorization, it was one of the hardest classes at my school, and it required a 95% for an A, so I knew that I would have to work the hardest in that class. There were definitely a lot of times in college when I would sacrifice studying for one class to study for a different class, and I would always choose to study for the class that I was closer to an A-, even if I hated that class. Now I realize that some schools do have curve-based grading systems, and so it's going to be probably a little bit harder to maintain a 4.0 in those types of environments, and I'm fortunate that I was not in that type of environment. We were given objective percentages to strive for, but if you are under that situation, you might have to work even harder in some of the classes where you're competing with some really intelligent students. So like I said, a very important part of maintaining a high GPA is being able to prioritize your time correctly. My second tip is to study extremely hard and not sacrifice any points if possible at the beginning of the semester. I always went completely overboard in studying for the first test in each class, and there are a couple reasons for this. The first is that when you overprepare and study way more than you think you have to, you lessen the risk of studying an average amount and realizing that it's not enough. Then after that first test, which you'll have hopefully scored well on, you'll be able to assess whether you were actually overprepared or whether you need to put in that amount of time into each test for that class. This is a much better situation to be in than being stuck with both a low grade and no idea how much work it takes to actually get a good grade. Another reason to try really hard at the beginning of the semester is because a lot of classes are cumulative and build upon the information learned in the first unit. When you do understand that first unit super well, then you don't have to worry about going back during the later units when you're expected to know that first unit information anyway and trying to remediate yourself, because that's something that you definitely won't have time for later in the semester. From my experience, most of the non-test assignments like projects and papers in a class usually come later in the semester as opposed to earlier, so those first couple weeks are a perfect time to really spend the extra time studying and figuring out how to prepare for each test. I've watched a lot of people, especially as a TA, slack off during those first couple weeks of the semester, and it really sets them up for failure later on. When you do start out with a really strong grade, you have a lot more freedom to relax later in the semester when everyone else is starting to freak out because their grades aren't as high as they thought they were. This is the only way I was able to stay sane during college, because in those last couple weeks of the semester, it's really stressful anyway, and if you have a bad grade that you're trying to make up for through your finals, then it's going to stress you out to a very unhealthy point. So now that I've covered the mindset I took coming into each class, I'll start going through some of the actual specific study strategies that I used when I was preparing for tests. I think this stuff really varies from person to person, so you'll have to figure out what works for you, but I'll share what worked for me in case it gives you some ideas. The first is to physically write out as much of the information as you can while studying. I don't know if it's like this at other schools, but on the first day of classes, a lot of my professors would always cite all the studies that have shown that writing information out helps you retain it a lot better than if you're just typing it or reading it. So ideally, in a perfect world for me, I would be able to take some form of handwritten notes during the actual lecture to save time later. Now I realize that for some classes this is physically impossible because there's no way you could ever write down everything that the professor is trying to cram into one lecture. So one way to use this strategy for those classes would be to go through later and write out all of your notes, but that would take a lot of time and I'm not sure that it's completely worth it. So one workaround that I would use in college is that I would bring my laptop, which has a tablet mode and a pen, to the lecture and bring up the PowerPoint that the professor had posted that they were going to lecture on that day and physically be writing on the PowerPoint as the professor was speaking. This worked well because I didn't have to write down everything that was already on the PowerPoint, and when I went back and studied later, I would be able to look through both the PowerPoint and my own notes at the exact same time and not have to worry about having it come from two different sources. Another way of implementing the strategy of physically writing things down would be to make a cheat sheet of everything that you would need to know for each test. I did this for a few tests and it worked out surprisingly well even though I wasn't able to use the actual sheet on the test. I found that trying to compile all the information from a unit into a single page really made me think it through and helped me to remember it better. One thing to keep in mind whenever you're writing something down is that you should never be mindlessly copying something down word for word. When you're writing things down in hopes of remembering them, you should try to consciously think through what you're writing before you write it. This takes you through a cycle of questioning yourself and what you know, remembering the answer to that question, and physically writing it down, which is exactly what you'd be doing for a test. Doing this ahead of time really helps you remember that information later and repeat that process on an actual test. I had one friend who used that cheat sheet method for pretty much every single test she took, and she always came back with a perfect or near perfect score. It's a pretty time-consuming study method that you have to spread out over a good amount of time and not just try and cram in the day before, but it's really effective. Another thing to keep in mind as you're studying for a test is to really focus on the things that you don't know. You may remember that this was the main point of my MCAT video on how I studied for the MCAT. If you try and spend an equal amount of time on all the information, whether you know it super well or not, you'll never get to the point where you've spent enough time on the unfamiliar information to really remember it. You shouldn't completely ignore the familiar information because there is a chance that they could pull some small detail from the familiar stuff and put that on a test, but the reality is that the questions you're most likely to miss on a test will come from unfamiliar topics, and you should be spending most of your time studying that accordingly. One really great way of figuring out what you do and don't know for a test is by doing practice problems. A lot of professors will not give you enough required practice problems to enforce what you've learned and to help you figure out that you actually know that information. A lot of the time you'll have to take it upon yourself to find enough practice problems to reinforce what you've learned and to figure out what you do and don't know. And some resources for this could include the book, or looking up questions online, or even asking your professor if they have extra questions that they didn't give you. And this doesn't just apply to conceptual courses like chemistry, although it is really effective in those courses, but you can also apply this to memorization-based courses like history. For those, you can try thinking of a topic and trying to explain it to yourself or a friend as thoroughly as you can, and then as you're explaining it, you'll realize the gaps in your knowledge and be able to go back and look at those gaps in your knowledge and fill those in. When you go back through and look up answers for those questions you came up with about the details you didn't know, you're a lot more likely to remember those details on a test. I know not all professors do this, but a lot of my professors went through and provided practice tests for each exam. These are also a really great resource for identifying the gaps in your knowledge so that you can focus on those. I always took any practice tests I was given as if they were the real thing, not taking any breaks or looking up any answers or anything. I viewed those practice tests as an opportunity to take the test without the high pressure of actually having it affect my grade and my future, and so when I actually took the test, it was like an opportunity to retake the test and do a lot better. This really saved me a couple times, especially when I would do really poorly on a practice test and then I would cram really hard before I actually took the real exam. When I took the practice test, I would always mark any questions where I didn't know the answer, because that way, even if I guessed, when I looked back through, I would know that I would need to review that topic. So I think this one's pretty obvious, but some people still struggle with it for some reason. If you want to get an A in a class, you can't give up any unnecessary points by missing an assignment or half-heartedly turning something in. Missing a couple assignments here and there is a really easy way to take your homework grade from 100 to a 90 to an 80, and those points can really add up over time and really affect your grade more than you might think. When you're trying to get an A in the class, you really don't have that flexibility to give up points all the time. Another thing I'll emphasize is that different strategies will work differently for each person. I'm fortunate that I can learn things relatively quickly and that academics have always come naturally to me. Depending on your personal life and your educational background and your national abilities, you might find that you have to spend a lot more time or use a lot different strategies than someone else just to get the same grade as them. You really have to figure out what works for you and seek help if you're struggling. Everyone has the potential to learn even the most difficult concepts, but getting to that point of understanding will look a lot differently for each person. Also, while grades are important, so is your mental health. Don't completely isolate yourself from civilization or stress yourself out to the point of getting an ulcer simply for the sake of getting a good grade. In the end, you have tremendous value as a person no matter what grade you get, and sometimes you have to take a step back from school to realize that. I hope this video has been helpful. I've tried to show you some of the strategies that have worked for me personally, but I think that some of these are pretty universal, so I'd encourage you to try them out.